Thanks so much for your welcome. I am delighted to be here. As you can see, I have no cat pictures, no multimedia show. It's just me talking. And I'm a bit of a fish out of water. I've attended many conferences in my time, probably too many, but never one like this. I've never been to such a large undergraduate organized event, which I actually find very impressive. The organization, I think, is brilliant. But it's also a conference about software engineering, about which I confess that I know next to nothing. So about the actual technicalities of what you do, you will find that I'm an ignorant keynote speaker. So why would I accept an invitation under such false pretenses? Well, it's a long story, but I'll give you a short version. I was born in the year that the transistor was invented. When I was a kid, I made crystal set radios. And in 1978, which was 2 years after I finished a PhD, the silicon chip was invented as a response largely to supposed Soviet threats to the United States, because they wanted something to deal with the warfare in space, which they argued was going to be the next thing. And the silicon chip was the key to the miniaturization of computing machinery in general, and to the use of computers as switching mechanisms, and thus to information technology, as it was called. By the early 1980s, I began to take an interest in the way that microelectronics, such as it was called at the time, was being hyped as a so-called information revolution that would produce somehow something called an information society. Now, I taught in distance learning courses in the mid-1980s, and indeed, I taught a course about information technology and society. And we were using for the communication with students, not just TV and radio, which was the basic distance means apart from letters, which were paper things in small paper containers with stamps on them. And we used a thing called, well, you'd now call it a modem. But the modem at the time was actually an acoustic coupler. I don't know if any of you have ever come across an acoustic coupler, but I think you'd probably find one in a museum. But anyway, in the mid-80s, we were using these things. And let me tell you, the acoustic coupler was a telephone handset, okay, one of the telephone handsets that you had to hold like this with one end to your ear and the other to your mouth. And it was a large double socket rubber contraption, and you had to plunge your telephone handset into the rubber contraption because those sockets were the acoustic coupler. The connection was made acoustically. It actually worked occasionally. During that time, I started to write articles, and I wrote 2 or 3 books about this so-called information revolution, well, about the social aspects of information technology. And in so doing, as I was writing, I discovered that one of the key areas about which very little was being researched or written was the handling of personal data enabled by these new technologies. What would be the social and political impacts of these new surveillance capacities? One of the books that I made actually came out in 1984, which seemed sort of appropriate. Would it be a big brother state that was being created? I was hired at Queen's University in 1990, when I was halfway through writing my first book about surveillance. In 1993, we organized the first ever surveillance studies research workshop at Queen's. And we invited all the North American colleagues that we could think of who had said something important about surveillance. And this included the person who was regarded then and subsequently as the father of Canadian computing, Kelly Gottlieb from the University of Toronto, who died, I think, just last year in his mid-90s. He gave a great talk at that research workshop in 1993, and I have not forgotten it, or the title. He called it Privacy, an Idea Whose Time Has Come and Gone. I won't tell you what else he said in that paper, but it was a really good one. He set a strong example, and this is what really impressed me and makes a connection between what I'm trying to discuss with you this afternoon and your place in the world. And that is that he set an example of social responsibility and political awareness in the computing field. Now, we didn't call what we were doing surveillance studies in the early 1990s, although we do call it now. But whatever it was that didn't have a name, we started doing it, and many others started to take it seriously. We met them and discussed with them in a multidisciplinary way. We always believed it was important to work in a multidisciplinary way and to include, as far as we could encourage them to join us, people from computing, software development, and so on and so forth. And today, many research grants later, there is a Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's, a global network of surveillance scholars, and a free online journal in the field. And there's plenty, if you're interested, there's plenty of stuff that you can find online. Surveillance Studies Network is the global network. Surveillance Studies, what on earth is the journal called? Surveillance and Society, that's what it's called. And that's, as I say, free and online. And if you were interested in any of the things that I was saying, there's a lot of my stuff that is on little YouTube videos and whatnot that you can find relatively easily. Somebody even made a Wikipedia page once. What do I mean by surveillance? What am I understanding by that term? Because you may not have the same thing in mind when I use that word. For a start, I want to say that it is not necessarily a negative term at all. It simply describes how certain tasks get done. I think of it in this way, as any routine, systematic, focused, and purposeful attention to personal details. The purposes that make them purposeful, purposeful attention, can range from protection and entitlement, care if you like, to influence or control. So although police and security agencies use surveillance, so does healthcare, so does education, and many other institutions and organizations. Indeed, in an era of social media, everyone gets the chance to do some surveillance, even though this kind of surveillance is lateral or peer surveillance, and it's horizontal, therefore, rather than top-down. But it doesn't stop it being surveillance, and there's increasingly a lot of good writing on social media surveillance within this. I've got a new book coming out in April, which is called The Culture of Surveillance, Watching as a Way of Life. And I look into the ways, not just that surveillance is done to us, as it were, but also how we experience surveillance. So it's not a top-down approach, it's about how we experience surveillance, and about how we, using social media and other means and devices, engage in surveillance ourselves, sometimes, of course, of ourselves, if it's Fitbits or other tracking devices that we're talking about. Interestingly, many people, despite what Kelly Gottlieb said back in 1993, believe that privacy is still a key issue. I think privacy is tremendously important, and I wouldn't want to underestimate it, especially if it's considered in its broadest aspects, not just me and my privacy and what encryption tools can I get to ensure that I'm not going to be found out by some agency that wants to find out about me, or even just that I'm not found out by my parents or my peers. Privacy is an issue, but it isn't the issue. When it comes to social media, it is actually usually privacy from family and friends that users are most concerned about, rather than in relation to corporations or the government. But not all see it this way. For some, there's a realization that online surveillance in particular seems unfair, in that one's life chances, one's choices seem to be affected by how we are seen and evaluated online. And that's what I really want the burden of what I have to say to be about today. But before I come to that, I just want to make one more comment about why I'm excited to be here today and why I feel privileged to have been invited. Thank you for entrusting a keynote to someone who has no technical background and little technical knowledge. I'm excited because it gives me the chance to speak with people whom I respect and among whom I'm hoping to find some partners. I believe that doing technology is a vital human activity, and because it is such, it's something that is ethically as well as technically or commercially answerable. What you do has effects, for good or ill, in the real world. You can create systems that enhance human flourishing and human freedom. And you may also make money and establish a reputation. And the two may go together. But if you think of the reputation and the making money first, then that is a less of an ethically founded approach, whereas seeking the human flourishing and human freedom is. So when in the blurb for this session, I asked the question, well, what are the priorities for creating an appropriate, sustainable, and fair media platform? It's not a question that I can answer. It's one for you to respond to, I hope. The question is there for you because you are the one who is likely to have an answer. You are the ones who are in the business of finding suitable solutions. The best way forward, I think, is if we can find ways to work together from different disciplines to work out not only what's a more elegant solution, and I'm aware from talking to my friends in computing that frequently looking for elegance in the solution is a prized aspiration or a more efficient algorithm, but what contribution, what active contribution these can make to a better world. Now you saw from the blurb that the thing that I wanted to leave with you was questions about scoring and ranking. In 2015, there was a product called People that was launched. This app allowing users to rate and rank each other. If you hadn't come across it, it's People with a double E, or triple E if you like, P-E-E-P-L-E. It allowed users to rank and rate each other, and it quickly attracted negative attention because of its capacity for permitting or even inciting online abuse. Not surprising. As a result, it was pulled from the market fairly quickly and eventually returned with some of its most controversial features toned down. But not all of them. Some complained that the app still had some serious problems. While the 5-star rating that it originally had became positive, neutral, negative, one could still find out, for a fee, how others ranked you. Meanwhile, the satirical TV series Black Mirror, which I suspect that you are familiar with, picked up more or less the same idea in the episode called Nosedive. If you haven't seen it, I'm neither showing it nor am I going to give you spoilers, but I can tell you this much. Lacey, the protagonist in this particular episode, lives in a United States where all interactions are constantly rated on an app that syncs with a device that is that allows users to see the rankings in real time. So you hold out your device and you rank someone, and then instantly, as you are ranked, you look on your device and see where your ranking has reached. And everything depends on the ranking. Your access to certain stores, your ability to get into certain places for coffee, whatever it is, you are ranked, and it has consequences for better or worse. For some people, it's a pretty terrifying show, and so is Black Mirror generally for some people. Certainly, my wife does not enjoy it at all. I have to find times when I can watch it on my own. The disturbing thing about Nosedive is that it portrays a technology not in some sci-fi future, but that reflects real life in the 21st century. And of course, that's the whole point of the show. The fetish of quantification is everywhere, especially in social media. The system depends on accumulating likes, just as in the world of Nosedive, one's reputation is built up or blasted by one's peers. And this is a continuous process without let-up, in which the stakes can rise or fall overnight, or faster. Lacey works really hard to boost her scores, preening herself in front of the mirror, or highly rating those who serve her in coffee shops, for example, in hope of a similar return rating. But when her luck runs out, the world turns savagely against her, refusing her access to services, shunning her in public, and generally making her feel a failure and a misfit. It's a pretty miserable world for her at that time. What happens within the show is, I think, extremely interesting, and it's worth watching the thing through. And let me just say, in parenthesis, that I also think that there are other media that help us to understand this world. Black Mirror isn't the only one. There are several others. I mentioned 1984 a moment ago. I have no serious quarrel with George Orwell, and I agree with an awful lot of the things that he said about Big Brother in 1984. And I think that his basic instinct to be concerned about human dignity and human decency, which is what he is primarily concerned with in that particular book, is admirable. The only thing is that the kind of surveillance that he's discussing does not really match what we experience in surveillance today. And we need to look at other media apart from 1984, and actually we need to stop using the metaphors that are derived from an era that is long before computing as we now know it was developed, that did not have nearly such extensive relationships between the state and corporations as we have today. All these things make, and others, make surveillance quite different from what Orwell was discussing. And if we stick with the earlier metaphors, we're not really going to understand what's happening now. I devoted a whole chapter of the Culture of Surveillance book to a little analysis of Dave Eggers' The Circle, because I think it's that important. Because it has new metaphors and different metaphors. It uses Orwell-type slogans, but they're quite different from Orwell's slogans. So if you're looking for a novel that discusses this, Dave Eggers' The Circle. If you're looking for a movie based on it, then although Tom Hanks and Emma Watson did a pretty good job at what they were supposed to do, the movie does not match the novel for quality, depth, or punch at all. I'm sorry. Mind you, I'm proud of Emma Watson in her standing out for the recognition of how she's a privileged white feminist. Anyway, that's enough about Emma Watson. Most discussions of the People and the Nosedive episode see the scary resemblance to social media in general and to the ways in which everyday life in that context may become terrifyingly vulnerable to the amplified judgments of others. Self-curation and affirmation seeking are commonplace features of the social media saturated world, so these consequences are unsurprising. One's social value, one's acceptability for employment, and access to services increasingly depends on precious, peer-produced reputation. Or does it? While the Nosedive satire accurately lampoons a social media addicted world, there's another reality behind the everyday quantification. Today's societies are increasingly, indeed, dependent on rating and ranking of everyone, but this isn't merely peer-produced. The whole edifice of contemporary marketing depends on evaluating consumers with a view to determining what they call one's lifetime value, that is, your value to them. What you are worth to the corporation determines how the corporation treats you. And the scoring is based on many activities: shopping, drinking coffee, ordering pizza, along with staying at Airbnb or using Uber, that people engage in on a regular basis. Now, this is not something brand new. I had a PhD student working on this consumer surveillance business 20 years ago now. But the things that he was looking at then have become hugely amplified now. Increasingly, a popular social science description of this is surveillance capitalism that draws attention to the huge success of internet corporations such as Facebook or Google. In this view, everyday involvement with phones, tablets, laptops, and other devices such as Fitbits is a conduit not just for personal data as occasional or discrete bits of information, but for a flood of details about who you are, where you're going, what music or movies you prefer, who your friends are, and so on and so on. You know about it. Internet companies obtain the data at no cost and sell the bulk data to other companies, as well as using the data for their own purposes. Based on an analysis of Google's business model, Harvard Business School Professor Shoshana Zuboff shows how internet companies have obtained access to what she calls the real-time flow of daily life in order to influence and modify people's behavior for profit. The companies believe that getting their hands on those data will enable them to subtly alter people's outlooks and activities, such that they become more and more dependent on the goods and services that they produce and market. Zuboff argues that the concerns raised go far beyond privacy to include a potential for undermining self-determination and even democracy. For her, it smacks of what illiberal and authoritarian states sometimes try to achieve, and thus challenges the very tenets of Western liberal democracy. Her argument is that as surveillance capitalism spreads, it will erode the limits that were once placed on commercial practices. Those limits included binding contracts, included understandings between the corporations and employees, corporations and consumers. The problem is that social participation, think employment, healthcare, education, now depends on internet access, not only in the global north, but increasingly in the global south as well. Whole populations rely on the benefits of the online world for their daily interactions with all kinds of service providers, as you do and as I do. If the logic of capitalist accumulation really does come to be based on the involuntary and invisible extraction of data from ordinary users, the tensions between participation and exploitation, as Zuboff sees it, could create new social cleavages and conflicts. You have to recall, however, that this is, if you like, a worst-case scenario based on the description of a business model, albeit a model that many would like to emulate. Also, those who aspire to be like Google would also be using big data to increase their operational efficiency, as well as to gain insights into consumer behavior and preferences. As well, many companies that would like to get on the big data bandwagon are having a hard time doing so. Why? Well, because they started out long before those corporations appeared that have information or data as their key resource. Their already existing systems are not easy to transform into anything like surveillance capitalism, however successful it may appear. The only way that social ranking and social rating could become a more central system of social organization would be if government took up the same game. It has to be said, however, that in another part of the world, China, the same kinds of data are being used officially by the government to influence behavior in ways that they hope will produce responsible citizens. And so the idea of government-organized rating and ranking is not out of the question. It's called the social credit system, and the social credit system combines data from employment, education, law enforcement, and social media to create what they call a trust score. By 2020, when participation in the social credit system will become compulsory, this is absolutely nothing to do with social credit as it was invented in Alberta in the 1930s, by the way. That became the basis of the, well, eventually the basis of the of the New Democratic Party in Canada. That's another story altogether. Some voluntary participants in the system of social credit in China are already spending time online boasting about the high scores that they have in that ranking system. So their citizen score determines all kinds of things. Future opportunities, for example, for getting a job, a loan, a place for your children in school, even getting a date. The idea is to build what they call a culture of sincerity. And the government asked 8 private corporations to provide the systems and the algorithms, including the massive data corporations associated with Alibaba and WeChat. To some, it seems like a kind of gamified loyalty system for nudging people into preferred behaviors, and presumably for leaving those with low scores out in the cold. And to be left out in the cold means slower internet, restricted access to restaurants, clubs, international travel, insurance cover, and so on and so forth. So the way that I've been talking about surveillance here pays attention to personal details, but it does so in a variety of ways. Once, surveillance was literally about seeing people, watching their activities, or perhaps listening to their voices. As surveillance becomes more and more specialized, so mere fragments of personal data are enough to monitor and track people. Scooped up together on a very large scale, placed alongside other scraps of data from quite different sources and processed at high speed, they become big data surveillance. And perhaps paradoxically, because the bits of data are so small and apparently innocuous, big data surveillance actually has some wide-ranging effects, for good or ill. Patterns may be picked up that were previously imperceptible, that aid in healthcare, for example. But at the same time, those patterns may prompt, for example, police probes when none are warranted. And such probes may also affect some groups more than others, depending on how the algorithm, the code that directs the system, is set up. So I was going to say some things about reliance on algorithms. Algorithms used for coding the patterns of the kinds of behaviors that are being looked at are common in a number of areas. I haven't even talked about the sorts of surveillance that perhaps comes to mind when you think the word surveillance, when you hear the word surveillance, the sorts that are used in national security agencies or in policing contexts, using things like predictive policing and so on. There are an awful lot of ways in which we could illustrate the same sorts of things, ranking and scoring systems within policing, within national security agencies such as our own communication security establishment, which is one of the people active within this conference. Those things are true and important in these contexts too. When it comes to something like Amazon, few would object when Amazon gets a few of their preferences wrong, when the algorithm didn't quite predict what you might want to buy. But if a national security agency or a policing department makes mistakes due to faulty algorithms, the effects could be dire on specific groups in the population. For example, leading to inappropriate expansion of a no-fly list to include those with no connection at all to violence or terrorism. And this kind of hidden discrimination has to be worked at, has to be corrected, has to be exposed that it happens at all, whether in corporate or in government sector. And as well, powerful interests can easily abuse secrecy for profit. While the demand for transparency is a start, a more radical change should also be discussed and implemented. All organizations that use data in these ways should be required to be fair, non-discriminatory, and open to criticism in their decision-making processes, dependent as they are on algorithms. So what are my conclusions? What's my takeaway? I've been saying some things about surveillance, and I've tried to define surveillance in a way that might be helpful for you to think about it. Especially, I've been talking about corporate surveillance involving data analytics within internet corporations and related industries. They involve personal data, especially in the ways that those data can be used to determine life chances and choices, opportunities, decisions. Some of what I've said is negative. Somebody asked me before I started, is what you're saying going to be negative? Well, some of it is. But I do take the view of surveillance that it's neither good or bad intrinsically. It's just not neutral either. And the same goes for technology and technological activities in general. They are not good or bad in themselves. I've already paid my respects to technology and technologists. But neither is technology a neutral practice. These are all things that are amenable to, open to ethical exploration and political contestation. The kinds of analysis that I've discussed doesn't mean that we throw up our hands as if nothing can be done. Far from it. For example, as we already know some of the likely directions of large-scale data harvesting and algorithmic dependence, questions can be raised from the outset. Is big data the new oil, as some pundits say? It dawned only slowly that 20th century oil dependence was actually environmentally destructive. In the case of big data, some of the negative aspects as well as the benefits are already visible. Technological, educational, and regulatory initiatives don't have to wait for some disaster to occur. Simple steps can be taken right away And you are the kind of people who are going to be involved in taking those steps. Many involved in software design and development have opportunities to work on systems that are geared to assessing and ranking human behavior of all kinds. And some of this, for entitlement to healthcare benefits, for example, is necessary and worthwhile. Some will work within large corporations in which their decisions and choices have little impact until they reach relatively senior positions. Others may work in smaller startups where it may be easier to influence corporate decision-making, but where major impacts may not immediately be felt. But the real questions have to do with how far such software developers and designers are willing to take a broad view to attempt to engage in socially responsible computing rather than simply accepting a dominant ethos of the company or believing that making a profit or pleasing shareholders is somehow an end in itself. As I said earlier, it seems to me that an ethical approach in computer engineering and software design starts with asking what will benefit human flourishing and human freedom, the common good, if you like. If you think this is an appropriate approach, why not work with others from different backgrounds and disciplines to foster some different approaches that attend to privacy, yes, but as I say, that's only one issue. Beyond this, to improving the accessibility and the intelligibility of the systems you're creating. So the question I leave you with is the question in the blurb. What would make for more appropriate, sustainable, and fair platforms? I don't know the answer, but it's a worthwhile question to raise. And it could contribute to making the world a more congenial, interdependent, and friendly place to live. Thank you.